How do you know when you've reached the final draft? And how do you know when it's time to move from outline to first draft? These are two questions I received in one of my Writing Mastery Academy live webinars. More information about those can be found in the description below, but here's how I answered the question. How can you tell when you have reached a final draft or developed the elements of your story enough to move on from outline to draft? Ooh, that's a really good question. I'll take the first half first. How do you know when you've reached a final draft? Okay, I don't think you ever reach a final draft. I know that's I'm gonna just kind of get a little bit abstract here, but I never feel like my books are done because I always feel like, oh, I could go back and just tweak that a little bit, or I could just make that character a little bit more lifelike, or I could just streamline a little bit here and cut some of this wordiness. Um, but in reality, there's a point where we have to just cut it off. Unless you want to be working on the same book for the rest of your life, which is fine too. Like if that's your, if all you want to do is just tinker with the same book, I'm not going to stand in your way. If your goal is to actually finish something and maybe get it published or get it out online somewhere, then you definitely need to stop at some point, right? I think the best way that you can reach a final draft is when you're getting critiques from people that are mostly positive with very little things to change, or you're getting critiques from people that you disagree with, or that you feel like will not enhance the plot, or enhance the story. I think there's also a level of fatigue that you reach when you've kind of gotten to the finish line. Once you've revised a draft certain many times, like you start to lose the love of the writing of that story, and other stories start to, kind of peek in, and you're like, oh, I just want to write that. And there's a dangerous game. You don't want to just abandon something because other new ideas are coming in and they're shinier and prettier. But at the same time, when you've gotten to a point where revising feels like such tedious work that the output that you're putting out is not inspired anymore, then you might be either time to set it aside for a while and come back to it, because like tedium and boredom is the worst place to write from. So you might either want to put it aside, or that might mean that you're done. But I think it's sort of a combination of all of those things. And it's also important to note that finished drafts, they're not going to feel finished to you. And that's okay, because a lot of us are perfectionists, and that's fine. In terms of how do you know when you've developed the elements of your story enough to move on from outline to draft? So this is definitely a plotting question. How do you know when you've plotted enough that you can start writing? Okay, if I could answer this question, I think my life would be easier, because I have a hard time kind of going, okay, I'm done plotting. I'm gonna move on. There is, for me, definitely a level of tediousness and boredom and fatigue that comes from the outline, where I'm like, okay, I'm just so tired of outlining this. I just want to start writing it. There's always like sort of an excitement to write it when I've reached a certain point in the outline. I kind of always joke that I don't start drafting until I've convinced myself that I've figured out the entire story and nothing's going to change, which you probably are laughing or you think is funny because of what I just said earlier about plotters tend to get very rigid about their plots, and it's hard for us to let go. And this is why, because we convince ourselves that this is the story and it's never going to change. But I kind of have to fool myself into thinking that's the case so that I can move on to the draft and figure out, what's going to go wrong, because things change all the time. So for example, my co-author and I of Sky Without Stars and the sequel Between Burning Worlds, we're actually now working on the third book in the trilogy. And we're writing a synopsis for it. So basically a really fleshed out outline. And we've gotten to the point where we're like, okay, we have put in as much detail as we can at this stage. I think now we have to start writing it, because we know after writing these first two books that there's going to be stuff that comes along. There's going to be problems that pop up that we can't foresee in this stage. And we need to start getting to those problems. Otherwise, we will just outline ourselves to the deadline and then we'll have no time to write it. So I think there's definitely a level of getting it complete so you feel confident in writing it, but also not over plotting it to the point where you're sort of wasting your own time, because a lot of these things may change. I do live webinars every month in the Writing Mastery Academy where I answer questions like this one. You can become a member by clicking on the link in the description below, and you'll get access to all of my webinars, past and present, plus all of my online writing courses. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.